Over the years, we've had several visits to Ireland, and the intention in this visit was to see a few places we'd missed on previous ones. On arrival in Dublin, we drove down to Maynooth, and then southwest to Cashel, and onward to Dingle in the southwest corner. From there we travelled north to Athenry near Galway, before driving back to Dublin. To meet the rest of our family who were joining us, to travel north to Belfast, and along the Athenry Coast Road to Londonderry, before returning to Belfast and then back to Dublin. After getting the train down to Sydney, we stayed overnight at the Ibis Airport Hotel. It's not the most classy, but it is very handy to the airport. After getting through security and immigration, we headed for the lounge, and 2 hours later, we were all boarded and on our way. On arrival at Dublin, we drove the 30 kilometres to Maynooth to find our apartment and also get a SIM card. Now, Maynooth is a popular weekend away time, and it being the weekend, it was pretty busy. At the entrance to the university are the remains of Maynooth Castle, and only the gatehouse that can still be seen, and also carries the united arms of the Boyles and the Fitzgeralds that can be seen over the arch. Constructed in the early 13th century, it became the primary residence of the Kildare, Fitzmaurice and Fitzgerald families. The Fitzgerald occupation of the castle ended in 1534 in a rebellion. The English force led by William Skeffington bombarded the massive castle in March 1535 with modern heavy siege guns of the English army, making a ruin of much of the medieval structure. The castle fell after a 10-day siege, and the garrison were summarily executed before the castle gate. The castle was restored around 1630 by Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork, but much of this building was destroyed in the 1640s during the 11 Years' War. We spent a lot of time talking to a couple of the staff historians, and they advised us to visit Carrick Castle, about 20 kilometres south of Cashel. This was a great advice, and the castle was well worth a visit, as most of the castle is intact. The original castle on this site was built in 1142, and the current dates from around the 13th century. It was granted to the powerful Butler family in the late 14th century, and the castle was enlarged and remodelled between the 15th and 17th centuries. The banqueting hall is quite impressive. There was also narrow, semi-secret passages within the walls. Over in the keep, we could see the portcullis workings. And of course, every castle has space for people that don't like. Now, there's a weir in the river that was used to power the mill. But isn't this a great position for a castle? The main reason for coming to Cashel was to visit the ruins of the Rock. Now, the Rock of Cashel was the traditional seat of the kings of Munster for several hundred years prior to the Norman invasion, and in 1101 the King of Munster donated this fortress on the rock to the church. Now, few remnants of the early structure survive, but the majority of buildings on the current site date from the 12th and 13th centuries. In 1647, during the Irish Confederate Wars, Cashel was sacked by the English parliamentary troops. The Irish Confederate troops were then massacred, as were the clergy. Sometime during or after the mid-1730s, the main cathedral roof was destroyed by Arthur Price, the Anglican Archbishop of Cashel. The reason for this is unknown, and the oldest and tallest of the structures that are well preserved is the 92-foot tower dating from around 1100. Down in the valley are the remains of Hoare Abbey, which was formed in 1270 and abandoned in 1540. Back in town, we visited the Folk Museum and were entertained by the owner, Brendan.
This is the last one that was built in the late 1800s. It was in everyday use up to as recent as 1986, and you had 14 children plus the parents living inside in that up to 1986. You had 11 boys, 3 girls, plus the father and the mother. I'm actually reliably informed that the father and mother only ever came out of that caravan for a rest.
The interior was a little bit basic. Now, he also had a good collection of tools, and I also saw a backpack. This used to be used for spraying bluestone on the potatoes to stop blight. And there was also another building with a lot of the 1918 rebellion memorabilia. We then had a rather slow 3-hour drive down to Dingle. Next morning we decided the weather was good enough to do the Slea Head Drive. Now, this is a beautiful drive along a 2-way single-lane road. So we had a nice drive through Dingle town, then headed for the drive itself. The roads around these parts are rather narrow, single lane with passing places at regular intervals. Our first stop was at Dunbeg to look at some old forts. Now, these stone forts date back to the Iron Age, but still received a lot of damage in a severe storm here in 2014. Close by, there's some houses that go back to the famine times. Our next stop was the Blasket Centre. This centre tells the story of the Blasket Islands and the people who lived there. It's also a great place to have lunch while you look out over the islands. Now, this coast is quite rugged, but everything that was taken to the islands was done by using these small rowing boats. And sometimes the people would get isolated for weeks. Life was quite simple. Eventually, the last inhabitants left there in 1953. Just a short walk away are the remains of the set for the movie Ryan's Daughter. This old schoolhouse they built there was seriously damaged in the 2014 storm. But from up here, there's a really nice view back over the valley. Another few kilometre drive will bring us to the Galaris Oratory. That is thought to be about 1,000-year-old church. The next day it was a bit cloudy, but we end up driving the 20 minutes from Dingle across to the Maynooth Castle. Now this castle was destroyed during a siege by Cromwell in 1650 and none of the occupants survived. It's set in a small hill next to the beach with huge storm-rounded stones. We really enjoyed our few days in Dingle. Now we were travelling north and visiting a couple of the towns that are the names of songs I sing. The first stop was Shanagolden and the nearby Shanad Castle. Then it was on to Athenry, near Galway. And on the way, we went to visit Dingle Cashel. The castle stands by the water on a little hill, but when we arrived there were many people and nowhere to park. So we decided to have a look around the town, but with the festival on and very limited parking, we simply drove around and then headed back out of town. And there was a really nice traditional looking hotel. We took the main road across to Athenry. Now, this was a really nice little Irish town, and we were able to find parking. First stop was the Heritage Centre, or we could have taken a guided tour around, but our parking was only for 2 hours. But the staff were great and very informative.
The houses are in the same spot. The priory, the church are in now.
Yes.
And the castle. Of the walls, 70% are still standing.
We then walked around to the castle. The castle was a ruin and much restoration has taken place, and today it looks very impressive. We were were given a guided tour that helped us understand the various stages in the building of the castle and how additional floors were added. And the toilet was rather basic, and discharge simply fell outside the wall. Now you can still see here where there were supports for the roof defence, and of course, like every good castle, there were secret passages inside the wall. And a couple of minutes away was the old city gate. And the old market square. From Athenry we drove the 1.5 hours to Westport. Now Westport is an inlet of the Atlantic Ocean, and the quay area looks like it's been rebuilt with rather good taste. We stopped there to buy a late lunch and then continued along the coast to find a nice place to eat it. But it was starting to get rather late, so we headed back to Athenry. The next day we drove back to Dublin Airport to meet up with the rest of the family who were arriving, and then drove on to Termonfarkin near Drogheda for the accommodation at Flynn's. And there's a really nice little river and bridge. We had to be up early next morning to visit New Grange, a 5,000-year-old tomb. The visitor centre was actually very nicely done. And once the restaurant opened, we had a great breakfast there. And then we walked across the bridge over the Boyne River to get the bus up to the monument. And our guide was excellent.
2 and 5 tons. Some of them weigh up to 10 tons, others around 8 tons. Massive undertaking to get them here from Slea Head, but they're chemically identical to the grey wacky sandstone cliffs over there at Slea Head. And that's where they come from. It's the closest place that you'll find this type of grey wacky sandstone.
There were actually 97 of these curved stones. The main passage in the tomb is 19 metres long, and the sun shines through the chamber on the morning of the winter solstice. Sadly, there was no photography allowed within the tomb itself. Then it was on to Carlingford, a medieval town with a really nice harbour. As with any medieval town, there was a good castle. It was built in 1190 and was taken over by King John in 1210. And eventually it was abandoned in the 1700s. Since then, there's been a lot of work done to it, and there are now tours available. Then it was into town to get some lunch. And here we found a gatehouse, doubled as a prison. And a few metres up the street was an old mint. Leaving Carlingford, we headed north to look around Lisburn and to meet up with some cousins. The next day, we travelled to Londonderry via the Antrim Coast Road, the scenic route, with our first stop being at Carrick Rede Rope Bridge. Despite the light rain, it was a pleasant walk down to the bridge with great views all along the coast. And being August, the bridge was rather busy. Once on the island, we could look down on a fisherman's cottage. It was a short, rough walk to the end of the island, and on our return to the bridge, we could see some of the caves that are dotted along this coast. Then it was a scenic walk back to the car. Back on the road to Londonderry, we stopped at the Giants Causeway. Because it was raining heavily, we waited while the rest went down to take a look. We could look back at our visit in 2012. Dunluce Cashel could also be seen much better in 2012. And so we arrived in Londonderry in rain. However, the next morning it was dry. So we headed out early to walk the intact walls of the city, starting at the double bastion on the top left corner. Soon, we could look down over the bogside. Then it was past Gunner's Bastion to Magazine Gate, and then on to Ship Quay Gate. After a stop for breakfast at the Water Bastion, we continued our way around. After packing up, we headed for Belfast and the Ulster Folk Museum at Cultra. Now, this is a great living museum that started in 1964 and covers urban and rural heritage. And of course, we had to start at the lolly shop, come general store. This always had to be on a corner. We then walked down the little town street and called into the school. I wonder whatever happened to all the kids that left a mark on these desks. The doctor's house was rather nice. Sadly, there are not many of these old houses left, but life is tough for them, and I don't think I would want to live there. We hadn't seen the church before, and oddly the pews or in family groups, facing in both directions. Soon it was time for lunch, and afterwards we took a quick look at the cinema before we headed across to look at some of the old farm buildings. That's peat, or turf. It's dry and it's ready to burn. Some of the farms were a bit more substantial. Leaving Cultra, we drove over to the other side of Belfast Lough to Carrick Fergus for the night and to meet up with some of the cousins. The next morning it wasn't raining, so it was a good time to visit the Norman-built, complete Carrick Fergus Castle. This castle was built around 1177 and was used continuously as a garrison for 750 years until the army moved out in 1928. It is quite a checkered history and it's well worth reading up on it. There's also good views across the harbour of Carrick Fergus from its ramparts. And, like any good castle, it has passages and rooms within the wall. And of course it has its own well. A fine castle indeed. Then it was back down to Dublin, stopping off the Mourne Mountains on what was a very wet and miserable day. The next morning we were off to the airport, heading for Scotland.